So welcome everybody. We have a great group today, and okay, so this week's Torah portion is Beshalach, and we begin at the very end of chapter 13 in Exodus, when the children of Israel actually leave Egypt. Finally, we've been moving towards this great event ever since the beginning of the book of Exodus. And before I start, I just want to, toss out a thought, and that is that I'm sure you're aware that there are many people who doubt the truth of the Bible, and there are in the last, especially in the 20th century, this became a big deal. What we see here, we're beginning with the Exodus, is a huge miracle, the parting of the Red Sea. And as I began to say, we have very often people who are reviewing incidents in the Bible that are historical kinds of events and questioning it. Well, did this really ever happen? And one of the questions that very often comes up by people who dispute the veracity of the Bible is they'll say there never was an exodus from Egypt. There was no such thing as this ragtag group of slaves entering into Israel in this big, entry under Joshua. That whole thing never happened. And of course, we believe that it happened as God said it happened in the Bible. But a couple of things that I just want to point out about that. One of the reasons I say it never happened is because there are no records and they have found many writings from ancient Egypt, and they have never found any kind of historical record that talks about a slave nation leaving Egypt. Of course, nothing about a parting of the Red Sea either. So it's not mentioned. And unfortunately, very often there are archaeologists and historians who draw conclusions with regard to the Bible based upon what they could not find. I'm sure all of you will appreciate that it's very difficult to draw a factual conclusion based upon the proof you didn't find. It's one thing if you find proof, but if you're concluding because you didn't find anything, that already is far more problematic. But one of the things that also you have to keep take into account when you're talking about the documentation that's missing is that, as a rule, in the ancient world, we did not have freedom of the press. And who wrote the stories? The kings. And what stories did the kings write? They wrote the stories of their victories. And so there's a great many written records, both in the area of Mesopotamia and in the area of Egypt, of things that happened that the ruler can talk about being to his great glory. He defeated someone. I don't know if it would have been in the interest of any of the pharaohs or rulers of Egypt to boast about the fact that they were smitten down by the God of Israel. So certainly something they would probably want to cover up rather than talk about. There is, by the way, records of some indication of some slave, or not slave necessarily, but some kind of freed slave or some kind of group of people that are known as the Chabiro that came into the land of Israel, and they think that might be a way of saying Hebrews. Okay, so just put that aside. That's really not so relevant. Why did I even bring this up? Because if we talk about everything we've talked about until now, as we're moving toward this final Exodus, we have seen very clearly that God has laid out his purpose in this whole process. His purpose has been that the nation of Israel, as well as the nation of Egypt, should know through this whole process, should know and recognize God. Okay, so we see, and that's why it's interesting to me, on the one hand, this denial of the fact it ever happened. On the other hand, God's purpose throughout this whole thing is that we should know that it happened, that we should know that this miracle happened and that this is God, that this is a testament to God's existence and to his power. So I want to go back and see from Scripture, from the Bible, what it is we're seeing in God's continuing to work out this plan and how it plans out. So first of all, we looked at chapter 14, verse 4, we see already God once again, it talks about this purpose of his. In this is said at a point where the children of Israel have already left Egypt. If you remember, Pharaoh drew them out. They said, go, goodbye. Okay. And here we are saying, look, this is God is already telling Moses what is going to happen. And indeed it happens. Verse 3, he says, Pharaoh will save the Israelites. They are astray in the land. The wilderness is closed in on them. It's laying the foundation for Pharaoh to say, oh, what have I done? I've let these people go. They're just a weak group of people. I can easily go and get them back. He says they're lost. They feel, they feel like they're lost. And what does God say? Then I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, that I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Okay, there again, that goal that God has in this whole thing. Essentially, what happens is God creates this blindness in Pharaoh. Pharaoh has just gone through 10 plagues. The worst of the plagues, the end, he's lost his own firstborn son. All of the firstborn sons in Egypt have been killed. And he recognizes, that's why he lets them go. He recognizes that he has been defeated and he lets them go. So you would think that just minutes after all that happens, the impression of the plagues would still remain with him, and he would be smart enough to realize, I can't go up against God. And yet here God says he interferes a bit, hardens his heart. What does that mean, he hardens his heart? He blinds him to that realization. On the other hand, I believe if Pharaoh's realization was that deep down, God could not have changed that. God could have, had him, not see certain things. But if he had truly absorbed the realization of what God was, who God was, then this wouldn't have worked. But clearly, God feels that Pharaoh still hasn't figured it out yet. And so he's going to do this extra step, forcing Egypt to go out, or causing Egypt to go out, and the full level of the miracle to take place. And of course, as we said here, the ultimate purpose is that Egypt shall know that I am the Lord. Okay? So what exactly was supposed to happen? Egypt now has gotten his chariots and then the whole army, and they're going out and they're following this ragtag bunch of slaves. What was supposed to happen? I mean, before it happened, nobody knew that the Red Sea was going to part and all that stuff. What was the initial plan? Okay. And I think we have a hint of what a potential option could have been. If we go back and look at the very beginning of the Torah portion in verse 18, chapter 13, verse 18, it tells us that the Israelites left, Egypt, they left armed, okay? And that's really very interesting, because why were they armed? What were they preparing for? So one possibility is that they already took into account, or Moses took into account, that the Egyptians may come and chase after them. And therefore they left armed with some ability to stand up to the Egyptians. Well, that's a possible plan, except if that were one of the plans, it failed miserably. Because we look now in chapter 14, verse 10, as Pharaoh indeed is approaching Israel, what happens? What does Israel say? Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Well, didn't work. They did not say, oh, we're going to stand with our weapons and we're going to fight. They immediately say, oh my gosh. Or if they were real good Jews, they would have said, oy vey, in good Yiddish. Of course, that's quite anachronistic, but whatever. Anyway, so they certainly, they may have had their weapons, but they had no intention of using them. And I think that it was impossible for them to slaves just leaving Egypt, having no experience of anything like this, to be expected to suddenly just pick up their weapons, turn around and say, boom, 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 and we got you, Egyptians. My goodness, it didn't happen. And in fact, what we do see is that later on, in chapter 17, they will use the ammunition, clearly, because after all of this is over, the Amalek will come and attack them, and there will be indeed a real war, and they will fight it. But that's certainly not what happens here. So what actually does happen? The plan changes, okay? And this is where God says to Moses, chapter 14, verse 13, okay? Moses said to the people, have no fear, stand by and witness the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will battle for you, and you will be silent. So basically, what Moses is saying to the nation, okay, you don't need to do anything. It's the exact opposite of taking out your weapons and fighting. Moses says to the nation, you just stand by and watch the picture. And that's exactly what happens, of course. It's the most amazing picture. They stand by. Well, they don't have to stand by. First, they have to go into the Red Sea. And you know, they go in, the waters part, it becomes dry land. They pass through the dry land. They get onto the other side. And then, of course, just as the Egyptians are following them, God brings the water back, covers them all, and that was it. And what does the nation of Israel see? They see this amazing, miraculous salvation. Okay, so basically, it's they're witnessing of this miraculous salvation with the parting of the Red Sea that enables the children of Israel to use those weapons when Amalek comes. And in fact, when you look at chapter 17, when Amalek comes, there is absolutely no response at all similar to the response that the children of Israel have here as they're facing the Egyptians. Here, they immediately cry, yell out, they're fearful. When the Amalek comes, Moses says to Joshua, you go lead the battle. Moses holds his hands up in the air, and the nation of Israel goes to battle. They believe that God will help them. They look at Moses's arms and they realize this is a sign that God is going to help them. What they have gained as a result of this experience of the parting of the Red Sea is a confidence, not a confidence in their military ability. They gain trust, confidence in their faith in God, which enables them to take up the arms and fight the fight. They are outnumbered. They are a ragtag bunch of slaves. They have no military experience. But clearly, it's this experience of the parting of the Red Sea gives them the ability to take up the arms and fight, despite their lack of confidence. And of course, there's no question, their defeat of the Amaleks is miraculous. But it's not the kind of miraculous that happens when they stand back and watch the Red Sea part. They don't stand back and watch God do his business and they do nothing. They fight, knowing that God is going to help them to win. So this is already what we're seeing in the development of this situation of what happens to Israel. What happens if we talked about what happens to Egypt? We're going to follow that in a minute. But what we're seeing here in the process of Israel is what happened to Israel. Now, we will remember that back in chapter 6, okay, chapter 6, verse 7, and this is not the only place it says it, but just one of many places. We talked about a few times over the past few weeks how God set forth his objective, and he had two objectives. One is that the Egyptians should see who God is and recognize God, and another is that the children of Israel should also recognize God. So if we look at chapter 6, verse 7, we see this, and this is a verse we looked at a couple weeks ago. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God, and you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. So that was the goal. And what we're seeing here, just after the parting of the Red Sea, we see that is exactly what took place. We look at chapter 14, verse 31. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. Okay, objective has been set out in chapter 6. Here in chapter 14, we see that the mission was accomplished. And indeed, as a result of the parting of the Red Sea and everything that the children of Israel witnessed as a passive being, they're passively involved in this salvation. It changes who they are. And as a result of this, they know God, they believe in God. And as I said, It is this knowledge of God and belief in God that enables them then to take up the arms and deal with the battle of Amalek that happens then in chapter 17. Okay, now let's look at what happens to the Egyptians. Again, we saw in the verse we looked at before, in chapter 14, verse 4, we saw then, just as God is telling Moses, go out and he's getting him ready for this, battle with Egypt on the Red Sea. He says again that the objective, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Where do we see that playing out? In chapter 14, verse 22. And here is in the middle of the parting of the Red Sea. Okay, the nation of Israel has already gone into the sea when it has become solid land. The water has formed two solid walls on either side of them, and then we see the Egyptians chase them, etc. And then what happens? Look at verse 25. God locked the wheels of their chariot so that they move forward with difficulty. In other words, they're getting stuck in the mud. This is even before the water is coming back on them. There's mass confusion that has been struck in the army of Egypt. And what happens then? And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. So in those seconds before they actually are all drowned in the water that returns, the Egyptians do recognize that they have no chance because it is God who is fighting for the Israelites. So here we see both objectives have been fulfilled. The nation of Israel understands as a result of this experience who God is, as do the Egyptians. So now the question is, who else knows? If we talked about, and I started this by talking about what documentation do we have, what evidence do we have? Sometimes the most powerful evidence of an event is not so much in how that event was recorded, but the effect that that event had on people. And that's sometimes the best evidence of everything, okay? So let's look, first of all, in the Song of the Sea, or the Song of Moses, which is chapter 15. It's a beautiful poetic rendition. It's this glorious song of praise to God that is, Moses leads the children of Israel in this song of praise to God right after the parting of the Red Sea and the deliverance of Israel from the hands of Egyptians. And there's wonderful, wonderful verses that I've been teaching on these verses for a long time, and some of you may have heard this, but I just love it, and I just have to talk about it again, because to me, this is the essence of everything. If we look at chapter 15, verse 14, here it's talking about how the nations surrounding this area respond to the news of this, or will respond to the news of this amazing miracle. The peoples here, they tremble. Agony grips the dwellers of Philistine. Now are the clans of Edom dismayed. The tribes of Moab, trembling grips them. All the dwellers in Canaan are aghast. Terror and dread descend upon them. It takes different nations and it talks about what happens. Now, here I will take issue with the translation when it says all the dwellers in Canaan are aghast. Okay, so first of all, the Hebrew word that this aghast is actually a translation of, the word there is namogu. Okay, it's a unique word. It is here and it shows up, I think, only one other place in the Bible, and we're going to get to that place. But namogu really doesn't mean aghast. It means melting in fear. Picture this. Somebody is so afraid. It's like they're shrinking into themselves. All of who they are melts before this power of God. So really, that's the more accurate translation. They melt in fear. And we're talking there about the dwellers of Canaan. Okay, so now let's see to what extent this description in the Song of Moses actually happens. Do we see evidence of this later on? The first evidence of the response of someone from the nations to this miracle of the parting Red Sea, of course, we see just a few chapters later in chapter 18, where we meet Jethro again. We had met him before. He's Moses' father-in-law, seemed like a nice guy. Okay, haven't seen him since then. He's a Midianite priest. And what do we learn in chapter 18, verse 1? Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And he hears this and he responds. What does he do? First of all, he comes to bring his daughter, Zipporah, and Moses' two children who had been staying in Midian there for a while to get out of the mess that was going on in Egypt. So he's bringing them back. But this chapter could have begun with verse 2, which says, and Jethro, his father-in-law of Moses, took Zipporah, and brought her back. But the scripture is telling us something far more important. He's not just a delivery service for wife and kids. He's coming also because he heard something amazing and he wants to hear more about it. And we see that also, we see that later on, starting with verse 8. Moses then recounted to his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen them on the way and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the kindness that the Lord had shown Israel when he delivered them from the Egyptians. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh. This is what is so interesting to him. He doesn't come to Moses and say, so Moses, what have you been doing for the last few years? How are you keeping? Do you have any headaches? I mean, are you okay? When the father-in-law comes and has this kind of reunion, you expect something more personal. Jethro is not about the personal. He is overwhelmed with awe with what he has heard, and he wants to know more. And when Moses tells him further details, he is just in awe. The first thing he does, he says, blessed the Lord. And look at verse 11. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. And it's amazing. Okay, we have here the most amazing announcement of a person who is not of the nation of Israel, that he now has changed his faith. He now recognizes that the God, the one and only powerful God, is the God of Israel, the God of creation, no other gods. They're just not relevant anymore. Okay, we're going to see a similar situation with another person of the nations, and that is Rahab. In the book of Joshua, chapter 2, we have the story of Joshua sending 2 spies to spy out the land in anticipation and preparation for the entry of the nation of Israel into the land of Israel. And these 2 spies come to Jericho, and there they already got caught. They almost get caught. This is the situation. And they are in Rahab's house, and Rahab protects them. And we hear a very, very, Rahab immediately understands who they are. And these men, these spies, are very worried that she may, turn them in to the king of Jericho. And she says something amazing, okay? And this is Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. She said to the men, I know that the Lord has given the country to you, because dread of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land are quaking before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Sea of Reeds for you when you left Egypt. Now, what's very interesting is in the Hebrew, it's far more pronounced, which is the original, of course. And one of the things that I would say, if I have a criticism of the translators, they should make sure they're using the same words when they translate here and when they translate in the Song of Moses, because it's the same words. It's almost as if she's quoting Moses as she talks about the response of the nations, and especially the use of the word namogu. Here it says the inhabitants of the land are quaking before you, and the other one she talked about aghast. I would say the same word namogu. Don't say quaking in one place and aghast in the other. Okay, use the same word, and it really should be melting with fear. Okay, in both places that unusual word namogu is used, and it's as if Rahab is quoting the Song of Moses. But it's not just quoting it in general. It is so specific, because when she's talking about the inhabitants of the land, okay, Who are the inhabitants of the land? The people of Canaan, the dwellers in Canaan. And that's exactly what we learn in the Song of Moses. The dwellers of Canaan have melted in fear. And here she says, the inhabitants of the land, which is the land of Canaan, are melting in fear. So here we have Rahab, who through using the same language that Moses uses in the Song of the Sea, it is just, this amazing thing that Rahab, her response to this whole event is, I now understand who God is. She's a God-fearing woman. And as a result of this realization and what she has heard, now she's actually talking about, everybody has heard this. It's well known. Everybody in the area knows about this. But what makes Rahab unusual is very similar to what makes Jethro unusual. Both of them are people who are not just going to hear about and say, that's really interesting. Wow, amazing. But they have changed their faith as a result. And Rahab goes and does something. She endangers herself in order to rescue these two spies. And of course, she then is saved by the nation of Israel when they come and conquer Jericho. They save her, and she actually joins the nation of Israel and stays with them. And this, therefore, we see, in this sense, the effect of this miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. It may not have made it into the annals of Egypt, but it made it into the hearts and consciousness of these people, of Rahab, of Jethro, and and I'm sure this to a much lesser extent is how it is perceived in the area at the time. Now, of course, this has amazing long-term effects because we see with Rahab, for example, her very recognition made it easier for the nation of Israel to come in and conquer the land. Of course, God is with them on their side, but this event has already created a situation that it would make that so much easier. Now, our sages have a very interesting statement when they talk about the parting of the Red Sea. And they say as follows. They say the simplest maidservant saw on the sea more profoundly and more prophetically than Ezekiel the prophet ever saw. That's an amazing statement. We know Ezekiel was a very, very great prophet. God spoke to him directly. He brings the prophecy of God before the nation and before us forever in the Bible. And yet, what this statement is saying is that his level of prophecy is nothing compared to what the simplest maidservant actually witnessed with her own eyes standing there at the parting of the Red Sea. And I think what that is also telling us is that this event was revelation. We very often talk about what was the ultimate, most amazing revelation of God to the nation of Israel. And we talk about revelation at Sinai. God spoke directly to the nation as thunder and lightning and all that stuff. Okay, here on the Red Sea, God didn't speak. He didn't speak to the nation, but the events themselves were the revelation. And sometimes events can become a more powerful revelation, a more powerful and direct message from God than actually words from God. And I think this is something that, and of course we see the lasting effect on the nations, but of course more than anything, the parting of the Red Sea had a lasting effect on the nation of Israel itself. And we talked in the last few weeks to a certain degree about the Passover Seder and how the Passover Seder itself is such an important event in the Jewish calendar. It's our way of preserving the effect, the memory of the Exodus from Egypt. I will just want to end with two. I know I'm going over a little bit, but I hope you'll bear with me. What do I draw from all of these? So first of all, as I said before, this is the historical record. The historical record is the effect that is felt on the nations, how the nations respond, how Rahab and Jethro respond, and all of us, the nation of Israel, and anybody who reads the Bible, okay? This has affected all of us. And it's something that we take with us. This in itself is the historical record because it's part of our consciousness, not just what's written, but what has passed down to us over the generations. But I also like to talk about one more thing. In Judaism, there's a very, very important concept called Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. And very often the way we use that term today is individual people realize that in our own actions, we have the potential to desecrate God's name if we do something that is not good, that is an immoral act, and someone says, oh, and that person believes in God, how can they be immoral? That in and of itself desecrates God's name. On the contrary, if a person does a wonderful thing, a good thing, and the word of that good thing gets out, then that becomes the sanctification of God's name, because the person who has faith, who does believe, is doing these things that enable someone to say, oh, that this belief must be worthwhile, must be something. But the original idea of sanctification of God's name is through an action of God, not through an action of people. Through an action of God. God himself causes an event so that the entire world will recognize the glory of God. And it went from what God does to what people do. And I think that's part of the message here. How important it is for God that his name be known, that his holiness be known, that his power be known. And with what we saw happening at the parting of the Red Sea, it is God's activities that do that. But us as individuals, we have the responsibility and we have the ability to move that sanctification onward by telling the story and by acting as people in our behaviors the way God would want us to be acting. And then crediting God for our behaviors by saying, this is what we have learned from God's word. This is who we are. This is how we act because we have faith in God. And that in and of itself becomes the sanctification of God's name. So I've gone over. I hope you'll forgive me, but I hope you enjoyed our lesson today. I'm willing to stay a few more minutes. If any of you have any questions or comments, love to hear them.
Sondra,
Yes.
Are you aware of any documents or any kind of archaeological evidence, coming out of Philistia, Edom, or Moab, any of these countries, where those documents or those archaeological artifacts would make reference to Israel and to what you were just describing, this quaking with fear?
I have not heard of this. I'm no expert in archaeology, but I'm not aware that they exist. As I said, the only thing that I know of is documents that refer to this Chabiru who enter into the land of Israel.
Yeah, I've heard of those,
but
too.
Not mentioning the parting of the Red Sea.
No, right, yeah.
Right.
Be interesting to know if there was any sort of archaeological evidence coming out of these other nations, not Egypt. I mean, Egypt, that's easy to understand that they wouldn't talk about that. Right. But maybe these other nations would.
But all these other nations end up being defeated as well.
Yeah,
so,
that's true. Yeah, that's true. They don't want to talk about it.
Right.
This is Diane, Sondra. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Awesome.
Thank you.
Teaching.
Amen.
Thank you.
Baruch
Shalom,
Hashem.
shalom.
Okay, have a good weekend, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.